this is where the art, the imagination comes in. Many of the lessons learned and the aesthetic standards that were established would be used by future generations in coping with the hostile world. Now, he said this in 1968. And Dr. Sterling Stuckey argued that the figure, the symbol of the circle, and you can go forward, the figure of the circle of the enslaved people, this is a form of a creative practice. And he picked up on this archetype of the circle. He described African-derived culture in the United States after the model of the circle. He was the first to mention the ritual cosmology of the spiral, the ancestral circles. Oh, what does anyone know what this first image is? And we should do it like this so you can sort of shut up. Anyway, can anyone just tell me what this first circle or this first image represents? You won't get it wrong. Thank you. Okay, so this notion of the circle or the spiral, this comes from Africa, all right? But Stuckey was saying that this idea of the circle is used to reference culture. So you can look up his essay. It's called The Circle of Culture. And he's talking about how this notion of what we believe is from the Congo cosmogram, is embedded in African American ritual life. Okay, y'all are experts. Can anyone tell me what this is here?
Ring
shop. Okay, so yeah, I got some experts. So the ring shop is the circle dance. All right. So once you see the circle of culture, you see it everywhere. Okay. And what we know is that the ring shop was one of the pre-Christian religious dances. I'll put dances in air quotes, but it was a ritual activity. It has been argued, and I agree, that this was a hoodoo practice. And in fact, contemporary hoodoos, as you see, actually practice a kind of ring shop. Some would say, well, yeah, that's Christian. Some would say it's not Christian. Some would say it's pre-Christian. The point is that the circle dance is a dance of power as well as the symbol of the circle. Dr. Stuckey also placed a great emphasis upon spirituality as a source of agency and collective empowerment for Black people. And in thinking about slavery, I think that some of his ideas have application to the present day when we talk about hoodoo. So really quickly, I'm going to define some terms. Next slide. Okay, there's his book. Wonderful book, 25th anniversary edition. Go forward some more. Okay, right. Just really quickly, some terms because I have a lot. And you all, I can tell you're already experts on this. Hoodoo is the name that has been applied to a very broad system of thought and practice that has been associated with Black American folk religion and magic. My book was called Magic because I found that religion's kind of a contested term. I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so that's hoodoo. We're not sure where this word hoodoo comes from. And this is absolutely interesting to me as a scholar. In the West, the Paiute Indians in what is now Utah used the word hoodoo to refer to the geological formations. And people go out there and they ski and do stuff like that. These spectacular rocks and their myths and legends of these native people say that these were spirit beings that once walked the earth that turned to stone. And that's why they look like they do. Those are called hoodoo. Okay. All right. And you can find these hoodoos throughout the Southwest. Okay. On the other hand, we know that in the colonial era, English sailors used the word hoodoo too. It was a maritime term, and it referred to ships that had been attacked by unexpected storms. So it was part of the Anglo-Maritime folklore. They would call these cursed ships hoodoo ships. So it's a vernacular term. And then, of course, among African American populations, it is said that the term comes from Hausa, from Côte d'Ivoire, okay, which means to arouse a kind of resentment or retribution. Of course, there were Hausa speakers in the enslaved Black community. Many of them were literate Arabic writers and so forth. So you see this word hoodoo has an uncertain provenance. It's really a mixed bag. I think that hoodoo can be viewed as an ethno-religion, but it might also be glossed as magic. It might even be understood as a science, as Britt Russer uses that term, fugitive science, to describe ways of knowing that derive from forms of African-based naturalism. I want to go back to this idea of naturalism as we get toward the end because it's tremendously important. I was thinking of the theme for this session, imagination. One can also think of Hoodoo and conjure as art, right? So we've got all these things are here. It's very holistic: art, music, religion, science. All right, and you can really see this in the ways that Hoodoo has persisted in African American cultural production. I would just say that Hoodoo is a practice and it's a belief that utilizes nature's resources to connect the human to the visible and the invisible world. All right. So the word itself describes a wide range of workings of people that use natural materials to both heal and empower the human being. So it's a category that calls for us to examine the interfaces between aesthetic forms and cultural systems and the environment. But I want to talk about Hoodoo in relation to the environment and to religion. So go forward. Okay, that's a good slide. All right. I like to describe Hoodoo practitioners. Most of my work has been done in during the slavery period, which, as you know, was a few hundred years. In looking at religion during slavery as sort of the crucible in which Hoodoo emerges, right? We don't know as much as we need to know about this, but I like to think of Hoodoo practitioners as the other religious functionaries in slave communities, just like slave Christian preachers. So here I'm quoting W.E.B. Du Bois, and he's talking about the world of the enslaved in Souls of Black Folks. And I just sort of replaced it because he talks about Black religion among slaves as being the chief remaining institution of the priest or the medicine man from Africa. And he says, the priest, this priest, I would say that this is the Hoodoo man, but I like to think about the conjure woman, appeared on plantations, was the healer of the sick, the interpreter of the unknown, the comforter of the sorrowing, the supernatural avenger of wrong. And then he goes on to say that this was not by any means Christianity. All right. One of the most interesting things I find though, when I look at some of the sources, the early sources, is that Christianity is definitely a part of Hoodoo as it is for conjure. So this is an image that you'll find in my book. It's really one of the most rare images that I have that goes back pretty far. This is from a runaway slave advertisement from the late or the mid 18th century. And I want to show it to you because it's the only document that I found. And if you go through these slave advertisement sources, by the way, they're all there. They've all been published. People rarely use them, but they sort of give you a composite of what Black folk looked at during colonial America. And this, I really want to underscore this. I find that even today, when people begin to talk about slavery, even in the public discourse, they're really thinking about the tail end. They're thinking about, you know, the Gone with the Wind and the Civil War, which is fine. Really, we want to get to the 1700s. We actually want to get back to that revolutionary era because there's a lot going on there. So this document is a newspaper advertisement. Back then, of course, you know, there's no internet or anything. When you lost an enslaved person, you had to put an ad up. And what makes them so strong is that you had to describe them. Okay, so this one is fascinating. I'll just read it to you because it's hard to read. It says, run away from the subscriber, the following Negro named Long Hercules, okay? Otherwise called Dr. Hercules, 1750s. His remarkable conjurations, and he talks about pig's feet, rattlesnakes' teeth, blah, 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 from several sick people, many of whom have believed him to perform miracles. So this tells us that at an early point, this is one person. It says that he left behind a child and a wife on the plantation. We can honor and remember him, but we know nothing except for this. Well, we know that he was a doctor who performed miracle conjurations. So I think that he's one of the first Hoodoo doctors or conjure doctors that we have documented. But when I found this, I felt very moved because as a fugitive, Dr. Long Hercules, and of course that's not his name. You know, they like to give these bogus, you know, Greek names to African people. As a fugitive, his body was subordinated by this economic order that endorsed as natural the ownership of other human beings. When you think about today, it's unfathomable. He lived, he died, we know nothing about it, except this, which is remarkable. Okay, excuse me. I also mentioned conjure. I often like to make a distinction between hoodoo and conjure, and my favorite word, voodoo. So conjure generally refers to a kind of hoodoo that works specifically with spirits. And this comes from the idea of conjuring spirits, which is sort of a biblical idea. Interactions, not just with spirits, but angels, many saints and other spiritual beings, including the dead. All right, so that's conjure. Often people overlap hoodoo and conjure, but conjure is very specific. And then there's the word root working. Root working refers specifically to the use of natural and organic objects, herbs, plants, elements in the performance of actions, of healings, or poisonings. And we'll talk about this in a second. I want you to think about the ethics of hoodoo and what it might mean today. This is something I get asked a lot about today. Not whether we can poison people, but the whole ethic, the ethical system that frames hoodoo. And then the word that none of you ever want to use again is the word voodoo. Those people who study these traditions don't really use that word. Voodoo is a kind of junk category. It's a junk term. It's sort of an imagined racial and religious element. Otherness, nothing to do with hoodoo. It's disparaging. Now, the original expression of the word comes from West Africa, the word vaudou with the UN, and in Haiti, ou, which is vaudou, all right? But voodoo becomes sort of this specious, imagined sort of a practice of misrepresentation, and sort of, you don't have to use that word anymore. We can talk more about that. Okay, so let's, and here's some examples. One of the problems that I have, if we go to the next one, is when we begin to go back to those early periods, and then one more. When we want to look at these, most of our sources are kind of Greek. This is witchcraft, according to the artist who identified it. We have no idea. It could be a ceremony. It could be some sort of imagined thing. And if you go back to the other pictures, the same sort of thing. Now, these are the sources that we have to work with from the period. So those of you who are interested in Africa, the transmission of Africa to the New World, or if you're interested in representations of African religion, it's a very dense archive. Lots of pictures, but what you end up doing, you have to kind of compare them to what they were called. This is sorcery. Well, I don't know if it's sorcery or not. It looks, we know a lot about what African people did. It looks like it could have been a ritual as well. Okay, so this is one of the troubling things when we try to study this academically. So, okay, but we do know about hoodoo, and if you look at hoodoo, you see that it has many of the same things going on. Thank you so much. It has many of the same things going on that religion has. It has its own adepts. It has its own spiritual authorities. Now, there are no priests of hoodoo per se, but practitioners had a leading role in their communities. Go to the next one. We know that there are, we know many hoodoo root doctors. This is a famous root doctor from South Carolina, and Dr. Buzzard, actually legendary because there were several of them. This is a conjurman who's Native American. So by the time we get to the 1800s, we simply know that there are a lot of these people. They are spiritual functionaries. I certainly want to argue that. And then if you go forward, okay. The idea that there are saints in hoodoo, which is a fascinating thing. This first saint is Black Hawk. Black Hawk is a local saint. He's actually associated with Chicago at one time with Mother Vicky Anderson. She brought Black Hawk from the West to this part of the country. Does anyone know who this saint is? I don't. I know that's what it says. This high time. Yeah.
See, like a kind of long lost African king.
Yes, yes. So a legendary figure, but High John comes to us, and you probably saw the scene in Sinners. He is manifested as a root or a plant. So High John the King, legendary king, we don't really know that much about that, is a saint or a spiritual being who manifests in the form of a leaf, and that in the form of a plant. So go to the next one. Okay, so my argument here is that Hoodoo has a lot going on that is similar to what we see in religions. Sacred functionaries, saints, spiritual figures, but also Hoodoo has sacred texts, especially post-slavery. So you see certain books that were used as Hoodoo practitioners as part of their magical and healing repertoire. Zora Neale Hurston said famously that the Bible is the greatest conjure book in the world. Okay, so one more. And by the way, that one in the corner is a High John root. So High John the spirit takes the form of this potent phallic looking root that is come down to us as a tremendous Hoodoo spirit. Unlike other religions, though, Hoodoo has a strong emphasis on materia. Blessed by nature, plants, leaves for medicine and healing. You find this more in African diasporic religions like Haitian Hoodoo or Yoruba the Ocha, this emphasis on the leaf as the master healer. You find it less so in Christianity, but I actually think that Hoodoo allows this to bridge Christianity. This is a practice where nature is abundant, right? Healing with organic materials and even animals, animal bones, insects, and the carapace are useful. And God said it was good. So there's an important emphasis on healing with the spirits of nature. So the bottom line is that, the Hoodoo healing tradition was created by people who needed it. For enslaved African Americans, it could be a means of protection or a charm against physical affliction. So what we're seeing with Hoodoo, I would argue, is that these are traditions that have been maintained over hundreds of years, okay? Over hundreds of years, and having endured tremendous circumstances of persecution and repression, okay? So even after emancipation, when Black people lacked access to professional medicine and healthcare, the easily acquired formulations of local Hoodoo doctors, conjure women, was a sound alternative. So Black people are turning to seek out their own healing practitioners. And we know this from the history of medicine, that African American medical and healing practices sort of take a different course from those of white Americans. Many former enslaved people tended to mistrust white physicians, for they were disinclined to serve them. We know that many white doctors treated Black patients with contempt. So why wouldn't Black people continue to use the traditions of Hoodoo and even conjure for their healing repertoire? I want you to just think about this for a second, that the notions of well-being, social wholeness are spiritual concepts. This is, what I mean by this is that a person's health and well-being is both personal and relational. Healing is something that is balanced against the presence of disease, misfortune, evil, and affliction. For Black people, affliction includes affliction of the social body as well. It is not simply the physical body. And this is fundamental to understand. And I think it goes beyond healing. All right. The social relations must be healed. All right. They are damaged. They must be healed. So Hoodoo, as a spiritual practice, enables that healing, if I say. It's a very different understanding of healing, but it's also, and this is the important part, it's also about treating the relationships in which we are embedded. All right. Go to the next slide. Okay. But there's a flip side as well. And this is the element that's more controversial. The idea that sickness can also be brought about through mystical means, specifically through maleficia, cursing, poisoning, or supernatural attack. Now, this might be very vital for enslaved African American communities. And of course, we know even from the history of Jamaica, the history of Haiti, where you have practitioners who are using these arts of aggressive mystical resistance. All right, maybe a little bit more controversial post-slavery, but that's something I love to talk about when we talk about the ethics of it. But the idea that Hoodoo provides something that's very vital for enslaved communities who are under siege. Okay, it becomes a means of resistance, and we certainly saw that in the film, of course. Okay, so what does this have to do with sinners? So as you know, I was asked to do some consulting work. It was a wonderful experience. I can't speak to the vampire part too much because I don't really like that kind of thing, but I would love to talk more about that. But one of the things that we do see, of course, is that we have a variety of Hoodoo and conjure women in popular media. The first book that was written in the early 20th century, late 19th century, by a Black writer was Charles Chestnut's Conjure Woman. This is actually the Conjure Tales version, but he wrote a story about the Conjure Woman. And then we begin to see this figure come into films in the 20th century. This is Valerie Bowles from Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, and go forward. Of course, the fabulous Diane Carroll. What's the movie's name?
Spies.
Spies. You know, I love talking to audiences like that. Look at that guy. What? Fantastic portrayal of the Conjure Woman, the Rootman. And again, forward, wonderful Angela Bassett on the television series, I think was American Horror Story. And then the best Conjure Woman was Coralie Day in the must-watch film Borders of the Dust. And then our beloved Louis Stockton from Center. So many of the descriptions of Hoodoo that we have are from fiction, the arts, film. But we need your stories to fill out this history. It's wonderful to tell stories. It's wonderful to write fiction. But where I'm going toward, when I think about the ancestral tradition, your grandmothers, your great-grandmothers, your mothers, other women who embody these ideas, who might not have even called themselves Hoodoo, all right? Those are the stories that we need to fill out what we're seeing in the popular culture. I really want to push this a little, because in the present day, there's no church of Hoodoo, but there's a collective of people who share a vision or a worldview of the sacredness of ancestral tradition. And this is where we get into a sort of that religion-y area. This worldview was informed by African ways of knowing and being. It could be found in the church. It could be found in the hush arbor under the trees. It could be found in the public ceremonies like the ring dances. But where you find it the most today, I would say, is at the gravesite, okay, at the cemetery, because there is a special emphasis in this tradition on speaking to the dead or upholding or commemorating the dead. And this is where people get a little nervous. But I would argue that the horror of death really isn't a big part of the African American idea. So, you know, you have a lot of popular culture, scary things in the cemetery. It's a scary place. I really don't think that's what it is. And I think that's where we want to turn it around, because the dead are not dead. So right now, I want you to think about and consider your own ancestors. All right. When I say ancestors or ancestral tradition, people always ask me, well, is this ancestor worship? Okay, are we talking about, no, I'm not talking about ancestor worship. I like to use the word ancestor veneration. Ancestor worship is something that Westerners in the academy associate with primitive religions. But if you think about it, everyone has ancestors. Everyone has people who no longer live in the body, who are remembered in our thoughts and in our hearts forever. And it's not just genealogical. In the Hebrew scripture, the form of ancestor naming was through genealogies, like in the Book of Chronicles that no one reads. They're begat, they begat, they begat, they begat. For pages and pages, they're begatting. They're naming the ancestors in a lineage. So this is perfectly resonant to create this chain of descent with all those begats. It's also a foundation. Ancestor worship is also a foundation in an American religion as well. This is the global American religion that we know of called Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. The Mormons actually baptize the generations of ancestors, and this is the largest global American, because only living people can serve the dead. So all deceased persons can receive baptism and confirmation for those who live in the celestial realm. Beautiful thought, okay? But even, and I have to say this, okay, even though the American nation has its ancestors, right? Who are the ancestors of the nation state? Our great founding fathers. I have to say that, okay? But the founding fathers who guide the civil religion of the nation. So everyone has ancestors. But when we get to African American people, it becomes a unique problem. Okay, and we kind of know why. This has a special resonance. The idea of ancestors is a contested notion. What I mean by this is that as African American people made that middle passage, the connection, that chain, unbroken chain, was sort of broken, sort of frayed, all right, to the point that most Black American people cannot claim their ancestors going back 8 generations, which is proper in West Africa. You can name your ancestors, all right? So the middle passage becomes a thing that creates sort of a rupture. Very, very important moment. Now we can understand the importance of cultivating remembrance of ancestors as a way of healing relationships between the living and the dead. Remember I said how Hoodoo is ultimately about healing relationships or connecting, all right? Hoodoo allows that. Cultivating ancestors, encompassing the idea that human beings, divine beings, God Almighty, those who have passed away, are all loved and respected beyond this earthly realm. We go to the next. Okay, yes. So this is really how I think about the grave. Okay, this is how I think about the grave with respect to Hoodoo. We can understand Hoodoo as offering a way of cultivating remembrance of the ancestors and the ancestral dead. Okay, so today, next one. When we see the grave, when we see the gravesite, we don't see it as a place of horror as it has been depicted. Even when we go to the street altar and the collective remembrance of the dead, we can call that Hoodoo. It is a tradition that allows for and that actually uplifts this idea of venerating the dead. And I'm not talking about ancestor worship. I think this is a really, really important point. I'm talking about venerating and remembrance. So the grave space can be a place where this happens. The cemetery, the grave, a place for practicing and caring for the ancestors, as well as the earth itself. Some scholars have called this Hoodoo conjure ecologies. And this is the idea that even the spaces in which the dead are can become sacred, all right? There is no religion that allows you to do this except for Hoodoo, okay? Now, we can talk about that. I know many Christians that, and we'll see in a second, they say, oh, wait a minute, you can do this in the Christian church. I would argue that you can, but it's not essential to this idea of Hoodoo ancestralism. Okay, to the next one. And there are ways that we can do this ourselves, okay? Next case. In the Chesapeake, there's a Hoodoo society that has been very active in creating a space at the cemetery, in particular at Black cemeteries, as a form of respect and remembrance for the ancestors. And I want to encourage you and motivate you to consider this kind of work of historical recovery as your kind of work with spiritual, with Hoodoo conjure. It's not particularly glamorous. You know, you don't get to fight vampires, you know, but I would say that it's foundational because it is a way of recovering an endangered form of Black cultural heritage and as a way of acknowledging and honoring those who have come before. And I'm really, really thrilled to have some members of the Chicago Hoodoo Society. The society that I know best is a group in the Chesapeake. And Hoodoo is actually experiencing a renaissance. Beyond online activism or spiritual activism, people are getting together in, on the earth itself. And I want to encourage more of that. So some groups like the Chesapeake Conjuring Society in Baltimore, Maryland, foster this sense of offline community belonging. And this society is a collective of Black people whose work focuses on community archiving and historical recovery. And I'd love to hear if this is the similar work that's going on in Chicago. I see these groups popping up all over the place. Really important, I think, because so much of Hoodoo is regional. So much of Hoodoo, because it is ecological. If you work with spirits, they have to be local. So the tobacco spirits that you have, or the spirits of the tobacco that the enslaved ancestors worked with there, are going to be different from the rice, the spirits of the rice fields in South Carolina and so forth. So the local practice of Hoodoo is going to it's going to have its own flavor. Chicago has its own very special flavor as a Midwest crossroads. And as we know, the crossroads is probably one of the most excellent and important symbols in Hoodoo culture. But this is a group, I think I only have a couple more, yeah, of Black people. They meet every now and then. It's something that they engage across generations. So you have young people, you have older people, and they do the ceremony usually at the end of October. This is also similar to the time when Dia de los Muertos, where Mexican American people go to the grave, and they go to the grave. They will name names of the ancestors. Pick one more, and just it's a beautiful working. I think that tending the landscape can build upon local practices of land veneration as well, which is something we need in this time. So Hoodoo, it becomes sort of a natural and a religion of nature. So, and I also like to think, because these are predominantly Black cemeteries, that these are spaces where conjuring Hoodoo and Christianity can come together well. I think these are healing rituals, okay? Tending the ancestors' graves, speaking their names, praying. I think there's one more picture. Praying during these ceremonies, singing songs. This is something that everyone can do. Does it have to occur under the auspices of the church? No. Okay. But this is what those who are dedicated to Hoodoo as an ancestral tradition are actually putting into place. Here, the graveyard, instead of a place for the dead to sleep, becomes a place of ritual experience for the living. Instead of a place of mourning, the cemetery is a place of communion and healing. Remember what I said about those bonds? They're in the middle passage that were broken. Someone has to do the work to restore them, right? So it's operating on many levels. So tending the landscapes, healing rituals. One does not have to have a dedicated priest or a clergy, but it's this legacy that has been carried forward in time for those who have dedicated themselves to such practices in all walks of life. We all have ancestors. We all have ancestors, all right? Some have more ancestors than others. No, we all have ancestors. And the extent to which these practices should continue today is a point of debate and discussion. But the distinctive spiritual focus and ritual knowledge of the Black Hoodoo conjurer and root worker remains strong. And we continue to uncover these stories, your family heritage, so as to learn more. And in so doing, we honor our own ancestors by remembering them. And these traditions, which are a vital part and an endangered part of our cultural heritage. Thank you. I cut out a lot there because I could see where it was going. And I think there's one, is there one over there? I think it's okay. Okay. I would love to hear, again, you can ask me about singing. It's fine. But you you sort of get my point that this is, it's not religion, it's not magic, it's not, but it's all of those things. It's art, but that there's a work to be done. Who wouldn't want to do this kind of work for what might be an endangered cultural heritage? So I would love to hear from those people who are actually doing it. I know there's some members from the Chicago. I know, I don't care, I won't tell you, but bless you, right? Because you're doing it now. And I've heard from, I do know one member of the group, but I hear from a lot of people who say, how do I start a society? How do I do this? What does it look like? That is where we know how to collaborate. You know, we know how to collaborate to get people. The things people ask me about most are money. We're not going to go there. and that's actually interesting. It made me think of that moment in Sinners where they want to pay with the script. Remember? And it's like, you know, the I don't remember which was the bad, but the brother's like, no, we need the money. I like to say that will follow, because it and you can share your experience. It might be expensive to start a conjure society. It might not. The expense might be in terms of time. So would you mind sharing a little bit? I know, I'm sorry, but I think it's wonderful that you're here, and thank you for coming too.
Yeah, so I am one of 3 co-founders, because this is not work that you should ever be doing alone, of the Chicago Hoodoo Society. For those who don't know me, my name is Jintan Rito. I go by Ja. And so I've been doing this work for a while now, but some of the co-founders I have also been doing the work in the community for a while now. And we realized that people wanted more communal spaces, but you can't hold that by yourself all the time. We still work, we still have families, everything else, but it's easier, the load is lighter when you have someone there to support you to do the work with. And it's a lot more fun too. What I have found is, like how you said, time is way more than the money that is involved. The money has come from people who want to join in and do the work with us from different community events. It comes about. We haven't received a single grant. We haven't even tried to go that route. We're still very, very grassroots. We haven't even been able to afford an LLC at this point, nothing of that nature. So everything that we do is just based on either community donation, or we attempt to have everything as free as possible, or even just out of my own pocket a lot of the time, especially when I know it's going to be needed for like refreshments and things like that. But we've made it work. We made it work. And I will say it's not easy, but I have such a passion for it. Like, I love my people, I love my community, I love my family, I love my ancestors. And I think it's something that needs to be remembered, because it was passed down to me, even though I didn't know it at the time, that it was being passed down to me. And I love that memory so much that I wanted to spread that to my wider community as well too. So while it's not easy, I would never ever stop a day in my life, because it's something that is close to my heart. It's part of me. So I would never give it up.
Yes, beautiful. You think, you know, I always like to go back to the 1700s. I think of the first Black church, which was a few miles from where I live. It's in Philadelphia. First Black independent denomination. They started something. It was the African method. They started something called the Mutual Aid Society, and I see these things are coming back. They did it because, you know, enslaved people didn't have much money. There were some people that had money in the community in Philadelphia, but it represented a model that all of those Black churches followed. It's interesting to see that model come back in the state. Now, where this gets interesting for me is that Hoodoo has become commodified. That's not a bad thing. I don't think it's commodity. I mean, when you're selling something out of your but the money issue has become more. And I'm not going to get in trouble, because I do respect those people who can sell stuff online, whether it's bogus or not. But they're marketing Hoodoo. So I mean, I think they have something to say too, or they're a part of this thing too. But it's a very resilient tradition. I say it's endangered. I'm not sure what that means. We're not even sure, what's proper hoodoo. There is no pope or person that tells you how to do it. But what's your name?
Jatan.
As Jatan? Jatan says it's a thing of, again, we all have ancestors. And we love our ancestors. And this is part of the tradition that was brought over and was broken. So yeah. Okay. Questions and please don't let me talk anymore. I really, really enjoyed this. But I would like to open it up for questions.
Yes, I just want to say I can relate, Chatan, a lot to what you were saying about how, well, my name is Camille, first, just to introduce myself. I can relate a lot just to what you were saying about how once you kind of like step on this path, if you're into ADR or like hoodoo, whatever it might be, you start to see how it's actually always been around you and it's been passed and you just kind of aren't able to identify it. And what I'm really excited about so I'm really excited about is how, to your point, the internet for me and how I believe for a lot of people has just put jet fuel on like kind of this reinvigoration around hoodoo and interest and connecting people who previously wouldn't know who to go to safely to talk about their kind of stuff. But what I'm kind of wondering, like the community feels, is I've been going on the internet and seeing like AI hoodoo come up, right? Or again, you said people who are like maybe not the, maybe have multiple things that are driving them to market. And so I'm so excited about how we're able to use these new technologies to inform our existing technology, but also how do we put guardrails against that? But at the same time, voodoo is something that is not strict, right? But there still needs to be some protection. So
yeah, this is the tricky thing. So people ask me all the time, and well-meaning white people who also have ancestors. I keep saying, y'all, everyone has ancestors. Can a white person practice voodoo? First of all, I'm not a practitioner of voodoo. I venerate my ancestors, of course, but I would not consider myself an expert. The expert is the conjuring woman who can create or do that and do that. So I can't even answer that question. But what I've seen as far as not so much guardrails, but sort of policing of this condition among young people, because I think there's such an intense, people want to avoid the thing being commodified or taken away. It already happened though. It happened in the 20th century. It happened right after emancipation, when actually places like Chicago, where you begin to get mail order hoodoo and conjure, white and black, where it becomes again part of the sort of marketed commodified tradition. So the question of whether there are white hoodoos, of course there's white hoodoos, and I know people get into fights over this, but I will just say that's why I titled this thing, it's an ancestral tradition. All right, if you have ancestors, you have ancestors from Africa, you have ancestors from Ireland, like the vampire, you have ancestors from England. All right, the ancestors are the spiritual, they're the engine of this group. So, and they have something to teach you about whatever practice you end up with. So I try to avoid things like that. That's, young people have a lot of energy when it comes to protecting, but there's more, save your energy for that society or that work of organizing people into a group that can do it, because that requires some real skills. Anyone can go online and yell. I should say, yes, good.
I have a question. Was that term would ever be used in like the teachings of like Dr. King or Reverend Jackson? Would they ever use a term like that?
They liked it. So, and probably the V word, voodoo. So after emancipation, actually before emancipation, there was this idea of Negro superstition, that the natural inclination of Black people, even when you Christianize them, is to go toward these superstitious African, remember we saw that way. So one of the words that was applied to that inclination was voodoo. it became a point of shame. Okay, when you hear something long enough, oh, you know, you're not even Christian. So they would not like that word, but I guarantee you in those families, there is a mother somewhere doing, she wouldn't call it hoodoo, she wouldn't call it voodoo, but she's doing that work. And that to me, those are the stories that are buried, and they're buried under the shame, and they're hidden histories. They're coming out like gangbusters. So I encourage you to do that genealogical work. I mean, I would guess that maybe half of the people in this room have some voodoo in their lineage. And that's what our ancestors can tell us. And they might be the bad ones. They might be like, you know, but yeah, does that make sense? They would not have liked that word, but it was part of the African American tradition. And I'll just say one thing: hoodoo is in the church, and everyone knows who knows that the best conjure woman you're going to find is going to be the church mother. She's not going to call it that, though. All right, but she can lay the hands on you and work the spirits and the roots, but they're not going to call it that. Does that make sense? Yeah. I know there's people in here. I can tell. Yeah, and I just want to say, even I saw the film. I told the director I don't really like that. I don't like monsters, this was Brian and Cindy Kugler, and they said, "Oh, you're gonna like this." Okay, but they did tell me the story that we see at the center, which is really the ancestor space where time becomes one. Remember, you guys, ancestors live in the past and in the future, because the unborn are the ancestors because they come around. So that moment in the center, and he's describing this to me, I'm like, and then as he's describing it, I could see it. That is the moment of the ancestral time coming into being really, really important, because it tells us that even the way that we understand and reckon time, it's not just linear. Indigenous people know this. They know that time goes like this, okay? And for African people, remember the spiral? It's like this, right? So that's what sold me. But I probably, you know, I was telling Francesca, I probably wouldn't see this movie unless I had something to do with it. I was so pleased, though, to be part of it, because I thought that they did a wonderful job. But the horror thing, a little bit much, but really, really important to represent our traditions respectfully, which is something that we don't see too much in Hollywood when it comes to, you don't even see the word voodoo, you see voodoo and you see, you know, the scary stuff, so.
Excuse me, I have a question and a statement, if I may. And my name is Malene Johnson. I'm a professor of Africana religions. So the question first, and then I'll do the statement. The question is, excuse me, is the phrase ancestral, excuse me, veneration functioning kind of as an apologetic over and against ancestral worship?
I think so. I think that ancestor worship, as I said, it comes from a kind of Orientalist and ethnographic view of Africans. But not just African, those, you know, even the Chinese, the ancestor worship, so it's associated with a lesser kind of religion. But veneration has an elegance around it, but it's also out there enough that you can, you know, you don't have to sneak it. I will say, I don't say, it makes my Christian relatives nervous to say anything about ancestors. So I'll just say remembrance. And they get that because, you know, grandma's picture's up there and you remember her. So, you know, you do it anyway. But I think, yeah, I think it's useful because ancestor worship just shuts it down right away. And it's something, again, it's a problem in the academic space, right? That those terms like sorcery, or what was the other one, the witchcraft, have been sort of imposed on these religions.
Okay, thank you. And the statement is mentioned sources, and I'm just saying there is a fabulous book, I don't know if you've read it, that is much like a primer called Voodoo, The History of a Racial Slur, by Danielle Boac.
Yeah.
B-O-A-C, it's the last name. And it really gives a phenomenal history of the word voodoo going back to France and the French and bringing it up in the ways that it has been used in media, in religion, and it's one other thing I can't think of right now, that is really foundational, I think, much the way your book is foundational for a lot of people.
Yeah, I wonder with this movie. Oh boy, so many people have told me about this, and I'm like, it's great. I wrote my book so many years ago, and there's actually, I think, better stuff out. Katrina Hazard Donald's book is really impeccable. But I wonder with this film whether we'll see the same sort of thing about voodoo. I don't know. I think that there are enough of us that will say you can't touch it the way that you touch voodoo. But Dana Boas explains how this term, and she says it became a racial slur, a religious slur, voodoo. And it's something I'm really interested in because of the Haitian roots, because voodoo was originally applied to Haiti, and Haiti has a remarkable and extraordinary history that not many Americans really understand, even to the present day, that they kind of erase it. So yeah, that's a good book. And Katrina Hazard Donald's book, which is called Mojo Working. Excellent book. Thank you. I gotta keep the books coming. I
have a question. So within your years of study, what is probably the most interesting figure that you've come across, like their background and history? Like who's probably the most interesting?
With respect to this,
yes,
or in general?
To voodoo practices or Black traditional religious practices.
I would say Marie Laveau. Because she's so, there's so many people who, Marie Laveau was a French Creole. She was a Creole, and we don't, that's the thing, I can say who she was and then someone else will write something else. We don't really know that much about her, but she's become a legend. So I would say of all the conjure women in the world, she is the one that's most well known. So, and I think that's why she's interesting to me. Everyone has a piece of her. Everyone, she's either a witch, she's her daughter, she's legendary. Down in New Orleans today, she's a Loa, which is a spirit. So, so she's fascinating in terms of what we know. I'm trying to think of someone that we don't know about. Long Hercules was fascinating to me, but the story ends. The story ends. And, I would love for people to get in those sources, because there were other conjurers in the sources, and just dig up the stories and say their names, right? So, yeah, that's a good question. I had to think of who, but she comes to mind immediately. Everybody knows Marie Laveau, but she's a conjure woman. She definitely is a conjure woman. So, yeah, that's a good question. Hi, yeah.
Hi, I'm Simone Johnson. I'm a professor here in the African and Black Diaspora Studies department. So I have two comments. One to the question of ancestor worship versus veneration, and I don't necessarily think that the term ancestor veneration is a kind of concession. I think it more accurately represents what's happening. And I think the reason that the term worship has been offensive historically is because worship is associated with God. One is supposed to worship God. And I think that that's the reason why it's maybe not appropriate, not because it's offensive in that way, but because that's not necessarily what's happening. Our ancestors are closer to us, in terms of like spiritual geography, so to speak. And this God who in a religious context is this abstract figure, and to venerate is to honor, which I think is what's truly happening, because in honoring our ancestors as well, we're kind of calling in their spirit to help us be active in the material world. So I do like the term veneration for one. And then secondly, I really appreciate what you said in your talk about the need to get in touch with our own ancestors and also to record our own family histories, because I think it's because all have ancestors, and I think more especially we all have elders, right, who we can access in the material world. right? I think our elders are actually the key to maintaining the tradition because, you know, I know we're afraid of like what's happening on the internet and like wanting to learn more, but I think we can learn more from the people in our lives who have stories to tell and traditions that they carry on, even if they don't call it hoodoo, because you're right, they probably won't.
Yeah.
And right, it is still, you know, their own ritual practices are very much connected to the practice that we understand to be hoodoo. So I think the way that we recover / maintain the traditions is by maintaining contact not only with our ancestors, but with our living elders, and recognizing that as people who are not elders, that we are, you know, kind of ancestors in training is language that's often used, right?
Yeah, and that makes it local, right? Because when you talk about connecting with elders, we're still talking about community. See, and I have no problem with the internet. I think it's a great invention. I'm from the 20th century. I think it's a great invention. But when we talk about community, we're not talking about online community. We're talking about the lady down the street, or the people on your block, or the people that you live near by the grave. So absolutely, and I love the emphasis on the local. And I'll just say this: the more you look at this stuff, hoodoo, there is hoodoo that overarches, but the way they do hoodoo down in South Carolina, those gullah folk, it's not better than the people that do it in Mississippi. And then when you come and then you see it in Chicago. So when you do a comparative study of this, you get to see that local flavor. My dream before I leave this earth is a national convention of your societies. And a couple of people told me about it. I said, that's too much work for me. But can you imagine that? Because it's still hoodoo, but the way they do it here, okay, is going to be different. Even in Boston has a hoodoo society, okay? So because Black folk are everywhere, all right? And that to me, there's something really powerful and beautiful about it. So y'all get to work on that. Organize the society. Yes.
I wanted to thank you, I think, for the terminology, Negro superstition. My mother's African American, my father's African. So like I asked my father about like, you know, like what did your parents think about like kind of like traditional African religions? And I think they dismissed it in this way of like, oh, that's like Negro superstition or whatever the, you know, French words for that would be. Because they're like, we worship God and therefore are protected by this kind of like more minor things. But I think even in that, it's interesting that they were kind of acknowledging the power like of these more traditional beliefs.
Yeah.
So that's a statement. And then I had a question about to you or to the room about like how we see libations, like what we're looking at right now, like kind of like pouring one out. Like if you think that is a kind of like hoodoo tradition, do you know more about the origins of that?
Yeah. I don't think it's from hoodoo. I think it's something we see across religions. You know, the use of the water is the ritual element. But you know, the African folk love that. They love to do that, and I mean, we do it here. What I'm trying to say is, I don't think it's African, but it certainly has been claimed as African. So, but it's not. I mean, you know, baptism, water ritual baths and stuff that goes back way before. So I like to say it's yeah. I think it's been appropriated by Black folk, but we don't know where it comes from.
I was just gonna ask if you like see any distinction between like a general kind of water purification versus I think specifically when Black folks do it, like the kind of like we're pouring out for the ancestors specifically. If there's any distinction there, or maybe not.
Yeah, I haven't seen too much of that footage. I mean, I think it's important. I think it goes right from the African cultural aspects, the religious aspects. I don't see too much. So I'm trying to think of it because, you know, interestingly, you'll find a lot about the English church. You study the Black churches, you study the early Black churches. They're doing things in those slave communities that have nothing to do with Christianity. I studied with Professor Albert Rabbit. He wrote an incredible book called Slave Religion. And so he goes to the earliest documents that he can find what people were doing and what Black folk were doing. They were going out in the woods. They had these things called hush arbors or bush arbors. They're many different things. So they were already practicing a nature religion. So I look to those rituals to see the kinds of, and you don't see too much about water except the baptism. So but I could be wrong. I think they got the African folk. I'm just guessing. That's a good question.
Hi. My question is also more about practice. I know you said you're not a practitioner, so I'll open this up to the room, but you spoke about the practice being regional and also the sacredness of grave sites and things of that nature. So I'm curious, how important is it to that ancestral bond to be buried in grave sites where your ancestors are? If you've noticed this in your research at all, or maybe it's not that important.
Say it another way, because there's people that are doing research on this outside of Hoodoo, because the Black cemetery is definitely endangered. It has been endangered. So there are people who document that. So say your question another way.
Okay. For example, my family, when they are buried, everyone goes through the same funeral home and they go to the same grave sites, or at least in the same city.
Yeah.
And that's a tradition that I'm sure not just my family holds.
Yeah.
Is this important to that ancestral bond?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes. I don't think it's, again, part of, what you do with Hoodoo. It's more like it's general ancestors, because that's the thing, right? So, and it's not just Hoodoo. So I want to make that clear. There are Christians who do this. They have ceremony, and the ATRs that do this ceremony for the unknown ancestors, because again, you can't name them. Some of us can, some of us can go back. So it's more like a generalized sort of thing. But you're asking a really good question about funerary tradition and what that means. There's a few good, not that many good writings on it. There's a few good studies of it. But it's becoming more important because so many of the graves have been disrupted, with the development. But no, if anyone else has a comment.
I also think that, particularly as like Africans in America, in the time we're in, where you might move somewhere for a new job or whatever, and so much of our location is somewhat out of our control, that we can look at traditions that, again, we don't even recognize as like adaptations of this, right? I used to work at an art auction house, specifically with African art, and learning about these communities and how they had like funerary statues, and sometimes there would be pieces of the body in them, or they're just imbued with the ancestors' energy. It wasn't until I came back home enough times, and like most of our moms have like a box of obituaries, right? And you throw it in there, and you never throw it away. And that's kind of like the African American version of that. It wasn't until I went to my first white funeral, and the obituary was like 2 sentences. I was like y'all, and then they're just throwing them away. So it's like, even if there isn't, I feel like the first rule about Hoodoo is like there are no rules of Hoodoo. And like there are so many tools that we can use to like build that bond. And especially if you're imbuing whatever object or place or whatever with that energy, like your ancestors will answer you accordingly.
Yeah, I love the way you put it. So much of it, and I don't like to say this because I'm a scholar, it's actually intuitive. When you feel that line that you're in, and you hear a story about great so you're like, wow. And that's the ancestor returning, right? There's something, I think it's spiritual. I can't say that when I write sometimes. But I can now. But in the scholarly discourse, there's no way to explain that intuitiveness. Now in theology, it's all there. So it's perfect. That was a really good.
I just have one last thing, and then I just have 2 book recommendations that I think would be really great as well. One is Chireau by Dr. Marimba Ani. That book took me like 5 years to read and only broke my head open in terms of understanding, to your point, how even ideas are following certain life cycles, and how I think we're right now in a cultural process within that cycle. And 2, a big stepping stone on my way to like understanding my ancestors and intuition was actually reading the Tao Te Ching, which is the foundational text of Taoism. And there in the Taoist understanding of the interaction between spirituality, nature, the metaphysical science, and also explaining that through poetry almost rather and almost what Africans would say is like proverbs, right? Rather than like academic text is something that's really, really interesting that I think is
Good, thank you, thank you, thank you.
We actually have a question online. I would like to.
Oh,
add.
okay, so online house.
Sorry about that.
That's nice.
So I believe this is Professor Opong. She asked, how can you, or I'm sorry, can you speak to the use of crystals in hoodoo?
Oh, yes, well, generally speaking, okay, so it's from the earth. Hoodoo's from the earth, so the crystal is from the earth. The crystal, as we know, represents a kingdom of nature, the soil itself. And hoodoo's, I'm not giving no secrets away because again, I'm not a practitioner, but the dirt of the land from the ancestors, which has the crystals, is very powerful. Now, we didn't talk about the ethical stuff, grave dirt, roof of dust, things like this are there for doing the negative or the aggressive magic. But yes, crystals, dust from even from bricks. So you have the iron, any kind of elemental form, crystals, plants, animals, organic. That is what this religion is. And we often go to the leaves because, like, yeah, we love herbalism, but think about the bone itself. Think about and there's been some good writing about that. Oh yeah, we can make a bibliography for that. But yes, absolutely, the crystal. I think when you first asked that, I thought of the New Age crystals that everyone has, right? But the earth is formed of those. Those are just more expensive and bigger. So because there was an argument, well, that's not hoodoo, but if you work with the earth and the dirt, you're working with crystal.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question about your experience with screenwriting? You mentioned a lot of things that you did not like about Centers, but I'm an animator. I would love to create an anthology to educate the next generation.
Yeah.
So what is something that we need to include when we're making art for the next generation to consume?
I can't speak to that because I'm not a screenwriter, but Kugler was successful because this was an original script. It was his story that he wrote into a screenplay. And his story, the reason he came to me and the other consultants was he wanted it to be historically accurate. So I would say that as a screenwriter, depending on what you're writing about, it's almost like a historical drama, all right, a historical fantasy. I didn't have anything to do with that, but when he described it, this is really interesting. He was so clear and vivid that I signed up for it because I told you I was very reluctant to do this. I don't know who's listening, so I'll tell you. But Ruby Masako was a wonderful actress. I wasn't familiar with her because I'm not cool, according to my daughter. But for the screenwriter, as you probably know, if you write, the actor has to embody that. So you have to be really clear as you tell the story. So, but that's all I can say about that. The reason that I think that they picked this up was because it was original. It was not like a dirty. I have a feeling we're gonna see more of these. And that's why I encourage you all, original stories that are authentic, or they might screw it up and we'll see all kinds of hoodoo crap up. I don't think we're gonna allow that, are we? Yes.
As our ecological landscape continues to shift very unpredictably, very heated, at this point, like hyper-technical capitalism, now that we've seen AI, do you predict a shift in our rituals and the ways that we rely on certain natural elements as they become less accessible?
I can't speak to that. When hoodoo moved from the South, where it was in an agrarian environment, everything was natural. You could grow the high John. When it moved to places like Chicago, no so much about it. Chicago's a great place, or New York, or any of these places, people could no longer access the natural place. So what did they do? They created mail order hoodoo, artificial, even I'll say fake stuff. So, I mean, the worst case, and it worked. I mean, people were using these, you can see the advertisements for this stuff. People were selling stuff that wasn't authentic or grown, but as a commodity, they adapted it. If anything, that's what's going to happen. People will adapt with, what they use. But I don't know. It's very sobering though, right? But this is what traditions do. They adapt or they don't continue. So, but the fact that it is such an environment, an ecologically centered tradition, there's such a premium placed on the natural and the organic. Come to think of it, people have asked me about this because some of these things are rare and you can't buy them and you shouldn't, and it's not correct. So they're already trying to figure out how to substitute or do things in a different way. I think you adapt or if you don't continue. Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder about that. I was good to act.
I'm just wondering if you're aware that the movie you mentioned, it has 16 Academy Award nominations. They broke a record. That's a record.
I saw the rush and I saw it once. I was surprised. I'm happy, very happy. And I'll be very happy if the actress I work with wins it. But was that surprising?
16.
That's so surprising. I don't.
The record was 14.
I don't trust him, but I'm really pleased that it was a successful film. And I actually, I don't like to think of it as a horror film. I know some of my friends are online there, so they're like, don't say that. I think because it's generated so many conversations around things that have nothing to do with the horror. I don't think of it as a horror, but that's a wonderful thing. It's really remarkable. Yes.
Yeah, this is a personal question from Hi everybody, Jennifer Gardner, Assistant Director. So my question, one thing you mentioned that I really want to hone in on is that health and your well-being is both personal and relational. And like as a Black woman standing, I know that my community affects my health and that when I'm happy, it spreads out into my community. So I was wondering if you can speak to the personal magic that mundane African Americans are able to harness, influence, or even kind of nurture in their own personal ways. I know that like we do our own ritual with the way that we take care of ourselves with our hair, our nails. In my personal research, I asked my Facebook friends how long does it take them to moisturize in the morning? Because that's a very specific ritual to our people. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to the personal magic that people can tap into.
Yeah, it's hard to find any documentation on that because people aren't saying what they do. I'm gonna say it's the ancestral practice, whatever that is, whatever that means to you. Because you could do the herbal stuff, you could carry your high John root, but someone else isn't going to do that. So, but the ancestral practice is spiritually edifying. So I think that's if someone were to say, what do you have to do to be a hoodoo? I would say you have to have some sort of ancestral, even not practice or. But I get in trouble because people think you got to go all out. You got to do, can I tell you all a joke about this? Wait, is the one time? Are they still there?
A few are dropping off, but they're still there.
Because these things are coming back. So the joke I saw was on Facebook. You all probably, some brother was like, he wanted to get into it, and one of the most important things that we know is that ancestors are hungry, not belly hungry, but hungry for attention. So the tradition is you pour water for them to come, or you give them something they like. You put it up there in the space. So anyway, I'm not going to tell a little story, but he didn't have time, so he got one of the McDonald's chicken nuggets. And he said he couldn't figure out why all these things were going wrong. but it's a joke, but even that's personal. Now some people, and I've had students, they can't set up an altar. They can't, and you can't even like candles. There are certain ingredients that every priest will tell you you need. You need fire, water, earth. You need elements. You do what you can, but that connects to me. That's hoodoo. That's hoodoo. It might not be as glamorous as throwing the bones, or not glamorous, but but to me that's it's harder to get to those personal sources. A good book to find this stuff, and I'm talking about, this is a thing with 6 volumes. I saw it pirated online. You might be able to find this, but in the 1920s and 30s, I think, maybe later, a white Episcopalian priest by the name of Harry Middleton Hyatt went around, so this is the 1930s or so, to many of the states and began to collect those interviews that you really need to do today. And he found these were all hoodoo interviews. The book is called, and someone can look it up, it's called Hoodoo, Witchcraft, Conjuration, something, but the guy's name is Hyatt. That's where you'll find the personal practices, because people were very forthcoming. The issue is, some scholars say, well, they shouldn't have talked to a white man, and half the stuff that they said was, but maybe the other half was. What's the full title? Can someone look it up? It's like Hoodoo, Conjuration, Witchcraft, and Root Work. It is 5 volumes of transcriptions of these interviews.
Beliefs accepted by many Negroes.
Yes. Yeah, it's a long thing.
Yeah.
It must be of over 1,000 pages. And it's been pirated, so I'm sure I'm not telling you to get it that way. But that's where you'll find some of the personal and even idiosyncratic practices. Say someone in Florida might do something one week, and then when you get over here to Illinois, they do it another way. That's called a grimoire. A grimoire is I don't like using those words, but it's a spell book or a recipe book. That's probably one of the most famous ones, and the only one that we have that has that number of black practitioners. So for the personal stuff,
It's in the libraries as well. You can certainly get it. I borrowed it from the University of Chicago's library many times.
excellent.
So
Okay,
it's
so that's
available.
it's a great resource, and there's been a couple of new books that actually make use of it. So, but it's hard to find that personal thing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is anyone? Okay. Yes.
Some
Yeah, to that point, I would even say that Michelle Lee's work in the Roots is another great resource, because it has a collection of stories from people all over the Americas who practice their different ancestral traditions, including hoodoo. There's recipes in there as well for different, physical and some social ailments as well.
Yeah. And can I say something else about Michelle Lee's book, Work in the Root? It's one of the places where we really see the Black indigenous presence. So a lot of us who became Black were Native American and vice versa. I would say maybe more than half or quarter of the people interviewed in that book are Native American. So it sort of opens up this idea of what it means to be African American when you're indigenous and working the roots. So that's a wonderful resource as well. And it does have all the rest and the personal stuff. Yeah, Working the Root by Michelle Lee. It's really fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for that. That's the good. Yes.
I wanted to go back to the topic about being able to be close to nature when our people came up from the South that were very, farmscape and open land up to a more urban city. And I don't believe that we lost this idea of nature. We just had to rework of how to find it within this new resource and space, because even I know my great grandparents had a plot of land when they came up here that we used as family resource up until even after they passed. But even still, there's still Black farms today that are here and our resources. There are people who are going out and foraging on the land. Like I host a lot of foraging events of native plants for this area. So it's not so much about what you were able to find in the South and trying to translate that up here, but more so finding out what plants you could work with here already on this land, because hoodoo was very much so a land work. So wherever you are, wherever land is, the work could always be done, because it didn't matter so much what we were tied to as much as what our history was for what we learned through our people to be able to venerate no matter what.
Yeah. I would also add though that when we get to the urban space, and this is where Katrina has a novel, we don't disagree. I was really fascinated by the way that Hoodoo changed once it got to the city. So you'll find much more of an emphasis on, I was talking to a professor over here about numbers and gaming. It's sort of like the blues. When the blues go to the city, the songs change, the music changes. When Hoodoo goes to the city, it's not, I'm not going to say it's not so much about healing, but it's about, I need to get that woman. It's a different kind of Hoodoo. It's still Hoodoo. So it might not have relied upon the same herbs for healing. Then, well, I need that protection mojo for me. So I think you're right, but also the Hoodoo adapts to the environment in which it's in. And in an urban environment, it's very different in some ways than what you find in the rural environment. And to me, that's absolutely fascinating because you can actually track the differences. It's very much like blues. And I'm glad I thought about that the blues itself travels and then it changes wherever it goes. And it speaks to the needs. People were, they were gambling, they were using the gambling hands and, and I like that my friend Katrina Hazard-Donald says, that's fine, but that's not the plantation black belt Hoodoo, which is that's the touchstone. I think it's all good and it's all interesting. So yeah, good. That's a good one. Did you ever get it? Yeah. Anyone else? I have enjoyed this. This is like class to me. But please, I would love for your group. If you all have, if you don't mind giving the name of your group, and maybe they could contact you.
Yeah, if you want to reach out to either be part of our business, so Chicago Hoodoo Society, spelled exactly how it sounds. Chicago HOODOO. That's also you can reach out via email, chicagohoodoo@gmail.com. We also right now we're mostly posting on Instagram until we can afford a website. Also Chicago Hoodoo Society. We are about to open our doors for what we've been calling those who want to be in the kitchen. So if you want to actually be part of organizing and creating more community spaces and things like that, we are about to open up membership again this year in like a week.
Doors open. Hi, everybody. I'm Jade Superi. I'm one of the co-founders of Chicago Hoodoo Society. So happy to be here. Ran from work. So doors will open February the 28th. Then you get to tell us about who you are and what kind of hoodoo you doing. And then doors close on March the 28th. So you have 30 days to, first to get to know each other.
I appreciate because I know the work. I know the work. We know each other too long. I appreciate. That's my dream. That even the film is going to provide this impetus for people coming together, and it doesn't have to be anything formal, but talking about what these stories, because it really is stories of, oh yeah, my mother did this. Every single one of you has some sort of story or knows about it, and that it could just be basic like that. So, thank you so much.
Everyone, thank you so much for being here, for your your contributions, conversations. So thanks again, everybody, for safe and everybody.